His gaze narrowed, and his tone became sharp as he levied accusations of impersonating a military officer. He issued brusque demands for identification, firmly believing no black man could attain such a position. What he failed to comprehend was that the individual he was confronting was far from an ordinary service member. He was a distinguished veteran, honored with numerous accolades for his extensive years of service, his uniform adorned with medals, and his record impeccable. Every detail on his identification would corroborate the truth, and any misstep by Daniels could not only expose his inherent prejudice, but also result in the immediate termination of his career, transforming his unwarranted arrogance into a career-ending blunder. Before we proceed further, kindly share your geographical location in the world where you are viewing this content, and ensure you subscribe because tomorrow's narrative is one you absolutely will not want to miss. The veteran, David Thompson, age 38, stood at the fuel pump, impeccably dressed in his crisp military attire, methodically refueling his vehicle. A veteran of the United States Army with nearly 2 decades of dedicated service, David had garnered multiple commendations for his leadership capabilities and acts of valor, receiving distinctions that most officers only ever aspire to achieve throughout their professional lives. His bearing was upright, his hands steady, his gaze fixed forward, habits of discipline ingrained through years of rigorous training and steadfast service. On this particular day, he was simply attending to a mundane errand, entirely unaware that his day was poised to devolve into a profound test of character, exceeding any challenge faced on the battlefield. As he handled the fuel dispenser, David mentally reviewed his agenda for the day: check the engine oil, procure some groceries, and then head home. He had absolutely no inkling that Officer Daniels was observing him with intense scrutiny, dissecting his every action, and misinterpreting routine behavior as overtly suspicious. Every subtle movement David made appeared to confirm the officer's baseless prejudices in Daniels' mind. This despite the fact that to any impartial observer, he was merely a veteran going about his everyday routine. Mark Daniels, 42 years of age, had been a member of the police force for 15 years, and during that period, a quiet accumulation of complaints regarding his demeanor and actions had begun to surface. He was known for his aggressive approach, his propensity to immediately assume guilt, and his reluctance to admit to errors, particularly when the accused did not align with the preconceived notions he held. Upon observing David in uniform, a black officer of significant rank, his mind immediately flagged him as an imposter. The notion that a black man could legitimately hold such a position never entered his conscious acceptance. His deeply ingrained bias colored every utterance he made and every action he took. Daniels approached, positioning his patrol vehicle to obstruct the fuel pump, an apparent assertion of dominance. "Step away from the vehicle," he barked. "I require your identification immediately." His voice projected an aura of authority, yet his eyes betrayed a profound skepticism. Patrons of the gas station took notice, some pausing their activities, sensing the palpable tension, though none were privy to the intricate layers of history and specialized training embodied by the silent individuals standing before them. David maintained his composure, his hand moving deliberately to retrieve his military identification. His fingers remained steady, unfazed by the officer's intimidating posture. "Officer Daniels," David stated calmly, "I am precisely who I present myself to be. Here is my official identification." He presented the card, its details crisp and official. Daniels accepted it, affording the credentials only a cursory glance, already convinced he would uncover some irregularity, something to validate his preconceived assumptions. Daniels retreated to his vehicle, the identification card in hand, muttering under his breath. David remained still, his posture unchanged, his calm demeanor a striking contrast to the escalating tension. The hushed whispers of bystanders grew louder, some discreetly reaching for their mobile phones, intuitively sensing the inherent unfairness of the situation. Each passing second felt increasingly heavy, as though the very atmosphere was charged with the anticipation of an impending confrontation. The officer initiated a check of the identification in his system, his eyes flicking to the display screen, where a green confirmation message briefly appeared. However, Daniels refused to accept the outcome. "There has been an error," he declared audaciously, though no one else could perceive it. The prejudice clouding his judgment distorted his perception of reality, convincing him that the veteran was still perpetuating a deception, still feigning authenticity. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not from anger but from a focused, controlled resolve. He understood what was about to transpire, and was acutely aware that every action he took from this point forward would carry significant weight. This was not merely for his own sake, but as a crucial test of whether justice could triumph over unfounded prejudice. Daniels squared his shoulders, storming back to confront David, his voice escalating. "You will accompany me," he declared, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or discussion. David's steady gaze met his, silently assessing the critical juncture, fully cognizant that this confrontation was poised to escalate, and that the officer was utterly oblivious to the profound ramifications that could ensue. This marked the conclusion of the initial phase, the deceptive calm preceding the storm, the moment where ingrained prejudice would collide with irrefutable proof, and where a decorated veteran would unequivocally demonstrate that preparation, patience, and legitimate authority cannot be subjugated by intimidation. Officer Daniels' control over the situation intensified. His voice, clipped and commanding, resonated across the refueling area. "Step away from the vehicle. You are not departing until I receive satisfactory answers." He gestured dismissively toward his patrol car, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat, as if counting down the seconds before he would resort to further escalation. Visual recordings from numerous mobile devices captured the raw tension in real time. A law enforcement officer confronting an individual who had not deviated from a single ordered stance, yet every movement seemed to Daniel to be indicative of criminal intent. "Sir?" David's measured response was calm and even, his voice unwavering under the pressure of the authority being wielded against him. "I have already presented my identification." Daniels leaned in closer, the physical distance between them diminishing, as if proximity alone could compel submission. "I do not care," he stated, his voice sharper than before and laden with unspoken threats of detention, humiliation, or arrest. "You are not leaving. Not until I personally verify this." He reached for his radio, his fingers hovering over the transmission button, signaling his potential intention to request additional backup. As Daniels's voice rose once more, customers nearby began to murmur behind their hands, their hesitation palpable. Mobile phones emerged from pockets and purses, capturing different angles of the unfolding scene, while hushed whispers circulated through the small gathering crowd. One bystander's hand trembled as they pointed discreetly toward the officer, articulating something about previous incidents, their palpable unease underscoring the rapidly developing imbalance of power. Daniel's eyes briefly flickered towards them, annoyance crossing his features. He did not lower his voice, nor did he acknowledge the presence of the recording devices, his perception of his own authority remaining absolute in his mind. "Move over there," Daniels barked again, gesturing towards the curb, positioning the veteran in a location where escape seemed utterly impossible. Each command was punctuated with sharp, emphatic gestures, his tone brooking no dissent. The crowd that had assembled shifted uneasily. Whispers concerning the officer's established reputation began to surface, quiet allusions to prior complaints, to a man who did not hesitate to escalate confrontational encounters. These subtle hints passed from one onlooker to another, a discreet acknowledgement of his documented history, yet Daniels appeared impervious to it, firmly convinced the man before him was simply being uncooperative. The veteran's response remained controlled and deliberate. "I am cooperating," came the low, steady voice, each syllable precisely articulated, betraying neither anger nor apprehension. Yet every command issued, every step the officer took, amplified the discernible imbalance of power. The veteran's hands remained visible, moving only to adjust the identification card held loosely before him, ensuring there was nothing the officer could potentially interpret as grounds for accusation. Nevertheless, Daniels persisted, circling, leaning in, scrutinizing intently, desperately searching for any justification for his own disbelief. A younger officer, positioned slightly behind Daniels, shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting near his notepad. His presence seemed intended to provide support, but his eyes betrayed a subtle hesitation. sensing the escalating nature of the situation was excessive. A small, barely perceptible nod directed toward the veteran hinted at his recognition of the power imbalance. However, Daniels ignored it, his voice growing louder, commanding increased attention from the assembling crowd. Customers and passers-by halted, their mobile phones recording the scene, their hushed conversations intensifying. The officer's authority was now on public display, his evident bias laid bare. Yet he remained oblivious to the intensifying scrutiny. The veteran's remarkable patience became increasingly evident through subtle gestures. A slow, controlled exhalation, a straightening of his posture, calm eyes meeting the officer's intense glare. Every response was meticulously precise and disciplined. It was a quiet refusal to allow intimidation to compromise his composure. Nevertheless, each second spent under scrutiny added considerable weight. The restriction of his movement, the inexplicable delay, the palpable anticipation of humiliation, the oppressive imbalance pressed inward, silent yet undeniably present. Every gesture of authority was magnified. Daniels muttered under his breath, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm against his radio. "We'll sort this out," he stated. "We always do." This pronouncement revealed both an unsettling confidence and a stubborn refusal to yield. It was a hint of the arrogance that had contributed to previous complaints. The crowd shifted again, observing this predictable pattern. The same rigid insistence, the same unwillingness to trust external verification. A man utterly convinced of his own infallibility. Then, a pivotal moment occurred that disrupted the established rhythm. A small document, an official verification receipt, slipped from the veteran's hand as he adjusted his identification card. It fluttered briefly to the ground, and a witness gasped softly, drawing Daniels' attention. He bent down, swiftly retrieved it, and for the first time, his eyes flickered with a discernible uncertainty, a hesitant pause creeping into his posture, a momentary lapse, almost imperceptible, but keenly observed by those documenting the encounter. That was the precise instant the officer realized this situation had irrevocably slipped beyond his control. The moment hung suspended in the air. Officer Daniels's eyes remained fixed on the document, frozen in a hesitation that was entirely absent moments before. The murmurs of the assembled bystanders softened, transforming into quiet, focused observation. The mobile phones continued to record, capturing every subtle twitch of a man who had previously believed his authority was absolute. There was no raised voice, no dramatic outburst, simply a prolonged pause that signaled the first significant crack in the authority Daniels had assumed was unshakable. The verification document in Daniels' hand was irrefutable. Every line, every detail confirmed the established facts. The identification card, official and unaltered, clearly displayed the rank, name, and service record in stark black and white. The numerals, alphabetic characters, and official seals left no room for subjective interpretation. Another glance toward the system confirmed the identical information. The database matched precisely. Nothing was omitted and nothing had been fabricated. This was reality, stripped bare of personal opinion, and it was utterly unassailable. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. The voice that had been sharp and commanding now faltered, transitioning into a lower, noticeably uncertain tone. His eyes darted momentarily toward the younger officer, who had been observing the proceedings silently. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod from that officer, a mere shift of the head, confirmed what Daniels was visibly struggling to articulate. The truth was now undeniably manifest. One of the witnesses, a passerby who had been discreetly holding their mobile phone to record the encounter, whispered to a companion, "He's actually a real officer. Just look at that ID." Another voice, hesitant and almost breathless, added, "Yes, that's legitimate. That's his actual rank." This soft affirmation spread rapidly through the crowd, not as a boastful declaration, but as a quiet, collective verification. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted without a single raised voice or aggressive confrontation. The undeniable weight of reality had proven sufficient. Daniels blinked, the tension visibly easing from his jaw, replaced by a fleeting flicker of comprehension. The commands he had issued, the implicit threats of detention, The insistent demands for compliance had all lost their potency. His stance softened, his hands lowered slightly, his posture becoming subtly less rigid. The unwavering certainty that had propelled him into this confrontation evaporated, replaced by a cautious, almost defensive wariness. The veteran's demeanor remained remarkably unchanged, calm, measured, every motion precise and controlled, exhibiting a high degree of professionalism. There was no discernible triumph in his expression, no vindictive glance cast towards the officer. His authority was demonstrated through an extraordinary degree of restraint, through the quiet, firm insistence that factual evidence alone was sufficient to command respect. Every second of his stillness underscored the principle that true authority cannot be coerced. It can only be genuinely earned and proven. Another officer, arriving belatedly from the perimeter of the gas station, briefly examined the identification card and immediately adjusted their posture. A silent recognition passed between them, conveyed through a nod, almost imperceptible but clearly visible to Daniels. This acknowledgment validated the veteran's legitimate standing without requiring any spoken words. The realization struck Daniels with full force at this juncture. His inherent prejudice had profoundly blinded him. His assumptions had been entirely baseless, and his subsequent actions had been demonstrably improper. Daniel's voice, when it finally returned, was now cautious and measured. "Carry on," he stated, the sharp edge of aggression completely gone. His movements were tentative, his hands careful to avoid any appearance of overstepping. The earlier confrontational demeanor was replaced by a subtle but significant difference, a clear recognition that the man standing before him was, in every conceivable aspect, fully authorized and legitimate. Every instinct he had relied upon, the ingrained assumptions, the pervasive mistrust, the deeply rooted bias, crumbled and dissolved in the face of the incontrovertible facts presented. The bystanders' mobile phones remained elevated, not as instruments of protest, but as impartial documentation. The hushed murmurs transformed into knowing nods, short confirmations echoing quietly. "That is correct." Each small affirmation reinforced the veteran's undeniable authority. The moment crystallized, with reality unequivocally supporting the calm, professional presence of the individual who had been unfairly challenged. The imbalance of power had not been instantly erased, but it had been decisively reversed. Daniel's internal awareness deepened. He recognized the potential consequences that now loomed before him, even before any words were spoken. A subtle, swallowed breath, a fleeting glance toward the nearest exit, and a minute shift in his posture all signaled his dawning comprehension. Internal review procedures, formal complaints, official reports, all now hung precariously over him. The realization was silent, but absolute. The control he had exercised was no longer his to claim. The veteran, still composed, acknowledged the return of his identification and the subsequent verification with quiet dignity. There was no immediate confrontation, no accusatory statement, no overt commentary. His presence alone conveyed an undeniable authority. Every movement, every subtle adjustment of his stance or hands underscored the profound discipline honed over years of dedicated service, effectively proving that true control and earned respect do not necessitate shouting or aggressive behavior. Daniel's gaze lingered for a prolonged moment, registering the significant nod from the secondary officer, the subtle glances from the surrounding witnesses, and the faint, persistent hum of recording devices. It registered the undeniable truth that his actions were now publicly documented, officially verified, and irrevocably undeniable. Any further action taken without acknowledging this reality would be an act of extreme recklessness. As the veteran began to move toward his vehicle, the mobile phones still actively recording, the hushed confirmations still echoing, Daniels initiated the first procedural correction. His hands were now visible, his gestures measured and deliberate. He stepped back slightly, signaling a definitive end to the confrontation. Yet the palpable weight of impending internal consequences lingered in his posture, evident in the hesitation that marked his movements. He had, in essence, survived the immediate encounter, but he understood viscerally that it had nearly concluded in a profoundly different and potentially career-ending manner. By the time the veteran calmly walked toward his vehicle, the pause in the interaction had stretched long enough for the onlookers to fully comprehend the significant shift in dynamics. The cameras had meticulously captured every crucial detail. Whispers and brief affirmative confirmations resonated quietly among the assembled crowd. There was no need for dramatization. The simple presentation of facts had sufficed. Daniels's perceived authority had been profoundly challenged and definitively recalibrated by the very reality he had attempted to dismiss. An internal recognition had begun to set in, subtle yet undeniable, a quiet, swallowed acknowledgement of his own significant misjudgment, accompanied by a careful, almost defensive, adjustment of his approach. This was precisely how the dramatic shift in power manifested itself. The formal consequences had not yet been officially applied, but the foundational groundwork for them had been firmly laid. By the time the veteran moved to complete his task, the hushed conversations among the witnesses had intensified. "That's his rank. That's official." Another officer confirmed this by glancing at the identification card once more, a gesture that was small in execution, but sufficient to cement the veracity of the situation. The shift in power was now complete, silent, factual, and undeniably established. The moment concluded with a single, unspoken truth hanging in the air. Internal review procedures would inevitably follow. Official reports were an absolute certainty. The recording devices had not ceased their operation. By morning, the ramifications of this event would extend far beyond the confines of the gas station. The verification of the veteran's identity, his legitimate authority, and the officer's significant misstep were all thoroughly documented, all undeniably factual. Justice, though not yet fully dispensed, had already embarked upon its irreversible course. Internal review processes were initiated with immediate effect following the confrontation, meticulously captured on the gas station's surveillance footage. Formal reports were subsequently filed by multiple witnesses, including the secondary officers who were present during the incident. Supervisors within the department were promptly notified, and the established chain of command commenced the procedural review. The Internal Affairs Division immediately flagged the incident as a high-priority investigation, citing the officer's prior documented complaints and the decidedly public nature of the confrontation. Every step of the subsequent process was meticulously documented, time-stamped, and archived to ensure the utmost accountability and adherence to procedural integrity. The visual evidence from bystander mobile phones, departmental body cameras, and the gas station's own surveillance system was systematically reviewed. Investigators diligently cross-referenced each source of information, meticulously verifying the timeline of events, the actions taken by all involved parties, and the statements recorded in real time. Policy manuals and departmental guidelines were extensively consulted to rigorously evaluate compliance with proper procedures and establish standards for engagement with verified military personnel. Each command issued by the officer, every moment of hesitation, and every subsequent action taken by the officer in question was catalogued and assessed against official protocols. Comprehensive statements were collected from all parties involved, including the officer whose conduct initiated the escalation, the veteran himself, the secondary officers present, and various witnesses who had either recorded the event or observed it firsthand. These collected statements were then analyzed for any inconsistencies, and any discrepancies identified were immediately flagged for further follow-up investigation. Every action was meticulously examined within its specific context, documenting not only the confrontation itself, but also the officer's established patterns of prior behavior. The accumulated evidence clearly demonstrated a repeated pattern of bias-based assumptions, thereby reinforcing the conclusions drawn directly from the visual footage. As the investigation progressed, formal recommendations were carefully drafted by supervisory personnel and legal advisors within the department. Policy documents pertaining to the verification of military personnel and engagement protocols for uniformed individuals were referenced, with particular attention paid to the noted deviations from established procedure during the incident. Each recommendation was weighed with considerable care, ensuring strict alignment with institutional standards and all applicable legal requirements. The officer whose actions had directly precipitated the escalation faced immediate administrative repercussions. A formal suspension was instituted pending the final resolution of the review process. Notifications were subsequently issued to the officer's chain of command, clearly indicating that any further instances of misconduct would inevitably result in immediate termination. The Internal Affairs Division thoroughly documented the entire case, ensuring that all institutional safeguards had been rigorously applied. By the conclusion of the investigation, the review panel determined that the officer had acted in direct contravention of departmental policy, had misused his authority, and had failed to acknowledge verified identification, thereby constituting a clear breach of both procedural and ethical standards. Consequently, termination from active duty was enacted. No additional measures were deemed necessary to ensure compliance, as the comprehensive documentation and thorough review had rendered the decision both clear and legally binding. Public statements were subsequently issued by the department, formally acknowledging the incident and detailing the decisive steps taken to ensure full accountability. The communication deliberately focused on factual reporting, outlining the actions taken, the specific policies enforced, and the commitment to procedural transparency. Media coverage rapidly disseminated the event, citing the clear chain of evidence and the officer's documented history of prior complaints. The coverage maintained a strictly factual tone, emphasizing the professional and institutional responses rather than resorting to sensationalism. The veteran, meanwhile, returned to his daily routines without any public fanfare or attention. His actions remained consistently aligned with his prior conduct: professional, disciplined, and composed. There were no public declarations of triumph or personal vindication, no calls for undue attention. His authority had been unequivocally verified, and procedural correctness had been unequivocally restored. All interactions following the event reflected his characteristic restraint and unwavering commitment to professional standards. Colleagues who observed the encounter remarked on the seasoned officer's calm demeanor and strict observance of protocols during post-event discussions. Their accounts corroborated that a professional approach was maintained despite the demanding circumstances, and their acknowledgement bolstered the understanding that the organization's core principles had been respected. The wider public's reaction continued to be restrained. Onlookers, news organizations, and parties with vested interests in the institution acknowledged the proper application of established procedures and the clear display of responsibility within the precinct. Brief declarations from authorities affirmed that remedial actions had been implemented and that instructional sessions were re-examined to avert comparable occurrences going forward. Public sentiment was shaped by the objective character of the records, the openness of the inquiry, and the evident protective measures put in place by the establishment. The concluding assessment put forth suggestions for modernized validation processes, obligatory retraining on managing identified military personnel, and enhanced guidelines for confronting predisposed judgments during typical interactions. The collected evidence concluded that compliance with these advancements would diminish the probability of a repeat event and fortify organizational supervision. In summation, the episode was completely settled through recorded procedures, enforcement of protocols, and organizational responsibility. Internal investigations guaranteed adherence. Team leaders verified adherence to established methods, and the individual officer involved faced firm repercussions. The veteran upheld a professional stance throughout, providing a controlled illustration of self-control when faced with adversity. All recordings, documentation, and reports were preserved for perpetual archival. A departmental evaluation affirmed that the actions undertaken aligned with established policy, legal frameworks, and moral benchmarks. Each phase, from initial reporting and validation to the ultimate resolution, showcased the system's capacity to effectively address improper conduct while preserving the institution's standing. If you hold the conviction that accountability should extend to all, irrespective of their authority, please subscribe for similar narratives.